War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 15, the space domain. Space, the final domain. I wasn't planning on doing this for a couple of reasons. First, the previous domains were discussed in the context of established foundational documents that have withstood the test of time. Mahan, Clausewitz, Duhay, et al. Space has no such document yet. Second, we haven't fought in space. No great battles. The Soviets did put a 14mm autocannon in space, for reasons that escape reason but are nonetheless intriguing. Quite frankly, we have stagnated in space. The crowning achievement, the Apollo missions, culminated in the 1960s when we won the space race. And this wasn't a battle in space, but rather a battle of information warfare, establishing the West as the technically superior side, despite the Soviets' initial lead. Third, even my definition of war rejects space as an area of interest because, unlike the other domains, there exists no sovereignty, which paradoxically makes it a little more interesting. While every nation controls the shores, land, and air above it, no one controls the space that soars above the rest of the domains. The laws of orbital mechanics inherently rejects the ability to control that what flies seemingly endlessly above the Earth. And if one is to accept the criticality of nuclear deterrence, then one must likewise accept the criticality of that area where the nuclear weapons would fly in between the launch and terminal descent. I have, in my very eclectic career, served for 3 years in what would now, I assume, be a Space Command billet. I have been awarded the Army Space Badge, admittedly the basic version, but of the 4 domains, I find space the least interesting. Maybe because I've never been there, nor has the vast majority of humanity. Manned spaceflight remains an expensive, largely taxpayer-funded hobby for the very, very few. And war, for me, remains a human endeavor. But with the establishment of the Space Force, I will hopefully provide an overview of the domain which, for now, has remained a side note to armed conflict. My primary reference for this will be the U.S. Space Force's creatively named capstone document, Space Power. This lack of creativity in naming the document is the first of many cracks I fear the well-meaning but poorly executed creation of the separate U.S. Space Force. Returning to sea power and air power. Both of these presuppose the domination of another power in claiming control of the sea or air through violent means. Space power does not. The U.S. Space Force lays out 3 core responsibilities for itself. 1. Preserve freedom of action. Maintain the ability to go to space. In spite of itself, the U.S. has, thanks to largely the efforts of civilian third parties, recently increased its ability to access space after years of neglect and decline. For years, we were reliant upon Russian manufacturing and technology to launch rockets and satellites, despite NASA's impressive budget. This is thankfully no longer the case. This strategic weakness was much of why responsibility for space was yet again removed from the Air Force and NASA. Number 2. Enable joint operations. In other words, support the warfighting services, almost entirely with intelligence and communications. This is another instance of why cyber, despite its importance, isn't a domain. The latter, communications, that space is responsible for, resides within the cyber and electromagnetic spectrum. So who gets that responsibility? Split responsibilities among different branches of service, despite our lip service to joint, has proven to be largely a failure. Third, provide independent options. The Air Force, having failed to do anything meaningful with their implied responsibilities for space since the 1950s, still provides the foundation for the Space Force. And independence from their responsibilities to support the other branches of service is the single most important mission of the Air Force, and now, it appears, the Space Force. You can be independent, or you can be joint. You can't be both. But here we are. What these independent options are is unknown. What is known is they will be very, very expensive, which is what really matters. Building your foundation on the branch that failed initially is a poor proposition. The joint definition of space is, again betraying its U.S. Air Force legacy. The space domain is, quote, the area above the altitude where atmospheric effects on airborne objects become negligible. A new thinking of the domain, while not a definition of the domain, is introduced that is more accurate in the first chapter of the founding document. Space is the domain of orbital mechanics. I like this a lot better because it highlights really what separates the air from space: the ability to orbit almost indefinitely above the surface of the Earth, and to do so over any country or region you wish to do so, while not violating any current international agreements. When it comes to information gathering, space is where it's at. There is a gap in the joint domain definition and the Space Force definition. The exact altitude at which atmospheric effects become negligible is not fixed. It is dynamic and changing based upon various conditions. Fortunately, if planes can't fly within that gap, but neither can satellites, it is of dubious importance. It may end up being the domain of some of the new hypersonic aircraft being developed. So if it is above the air domain, but below the space domain, who would own this? Probably, and against all logic, if manned it would be the Air Force, and unmanned, Space Command. But an academic discussion for another time. The key point is to understand the current joint definition may not hold up much longer, as this gap may be too big to ignore. As with all things in our very model of a modern military, this new space doctrine is full of buzzwords and MBA-infused platitudes that will age as well as the architecture at the Air Force Academy. Lean, holistic, cognitive dimension. These aren't inherently bad, but much as brevity is the soul of wit, simplicity is the heart of effective doctrine, which leads us to the next buzzword-infused key concept, key orbital trajectories, or acronymized, I wanted to invent a word there, into COTS, or simply put, orbits. There are three primary orbits listed in order from nearest to farthest from the Earth: low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, and geosynchronous orbits. All are critical for military operations in different ways. The vast majority of man-made satellites, as opposed to celestial satellites like our moon, are in low Earth orbit, or LEO. The International Space Station, for instance. The closer to the Earth, the faster they are relative to the surface of the Earth. I promise all discussions of relativity will remain, thankfully, at this level of physics. So more satellites are needed to cover the same geographic space. The shorter range to the Earth makes intelligence-gathering satellites able to see more detail, but either demands gaps in their coverage or, again, more satellites. Medium Earth orbits are where the GPS constellations reside. The longer relative position allows the signals to reach the various GPS units for a longer period of time, allowing fewer satellites to perform the same mission. The geosynchronous, or geosync orbits, are highly valued, both from a military and civilian perspective. What may take over a dozen satellites in low Earth orbit can be achieved by one in geosync, roughly 22,000 miles away from Earth. On the other hand, LEO satellites are, by definition, less than 1,200 miles from the Earth's surface, with 500 miles being the most occupied area. So the size and power of the required satellites and ease of getting those satellites into the orbit, or COTS, makes it the domain of less robust spacefaring nations and entities. So the vast space between 1,200 and 22,000 miles would, intuitively, be the medium Earth orbit. We can start to quibble about highly elliptical orbits which regularly pass between LEO and even beyond geosync areas and are required for higher latitude coverages, but you get the point. 500 miles is somewhat the magic point for LEO, for the simple reason that it is here where the atmospheric effects on satellites become negligible. Below that, and even the tiny remnants of atmosphere will quickly degrade the orbits of satellites. So we get back to that gap between the air domain and space domain. Above about 15 miles, even the most advanced aircraft are barely maneuverable. So the space between 15 miles and 500 miles is an interesting point, which may be the realm of the aforementioned hypersonic vehicles and to whomever shall control and use them. You are only a postdoctorate away from a full understanding of space and orbital mechanics. Go get 'em, Tiger. Next, we'll go over the 5 military space power core competencies and their doctrinal definition with some brief discussions. Space security establishes and promotes stable conditions for the safe and secure access to space activities for civil, commercial, intelligence community, and multinational partners. Here, cooperation overrides competition. Everyone has to play nice, and this is, for now, a mutually beneficial status of cooperation, not the competition of mutually exclusive objectives, which defines war. Combat power projection integrates defensive and offensive operations to maintain a desired level of freedom of action relative to an adversary. Combat power projection, in concert with other competencies, enhances freedom of action by deterring aggression or compelling an adversary to change behavior. In a clumsy cut and paste from Air Force doctrine, which has defensive counter-air and offensive counter-air, Space Force has two defensive and offensive defined power projection. Defensive seems simplistic enough in theory, though is, in application, exceedingly difficult, with a lot of creative and probably classified means to execute. On the offensive side, aka attacking, they are almost entirely dependent upon other domains, such as cyber or attack land-based control nodes. Much of the reason, again, I reject cyber as a separate domain. While kinetic anti-satellite technologies exist and have been tested, they come at a huge problem. Things in orbit, by definition, stay there for a long time. Years, decades, some for centuries. And when you physically destroy something in orbit, it goes from one object to thousands. And those thousands will all have their own orbits. And skipping ahead to the last core competency, the U.S. Space Force has a mission to track every single object in orbit to ensure unwanted collisions don't occur. Unlike kinetic actions in other domains where gravity ensures that the debris removes itself, no such thing exists in space. A war of anti-satellite missiles could effectively salt space, rendering not just the low Earth orbit, but other higher orbits unusable for an indefinite period of time, effectively permanent, lacking a technology to clean the orbits of debris. MAD applies in space, albeit not at the direct human level. Those countries most dependent on space for their warfighting capability are those most sensitive to the threat. But they are also, thankfully, the only ones currently capable of conducting anti-satellite attacks. Should more antagonistic nations acquire this capability in depth, think North Korea or Iran, this would prove a daunting challenge, as their juice and squeeze calculation would be far different than ours. Controlling the proliferation of these technologies should be as high a priority as controlling nuclear proliferation, and for much the same reasons. Space, mobility, and logistics enables movement and support of military equipment and personnel in the space domain, from the space domain back to Earth and to the space domain. So that is the launch vehicles and re-entry vehicles that are really cool to watch, but shouldn't require too much explanation. Information mobility provides timely, rapid, and reliable collection and transportation of data across the range of military operations in support of tactical, operational, and strategic decision-making, aka communications. They had to make it difficult. Space domain awareness encompasses the effective identification, characterization, and understanding of any factor associated with the space domain that could affect space operations and thereby impact the security, safety, economy, or environment of our nation. This is primarily the object monitoring and looking at space mission, as opposed to using space to look at Earth mission. No offspring of the Air Force could be expected to establish a doctrine without first letting everyone know how strategic and independent they are, and the Space Force doesn't disappoint, which is another and probably the biggest problem. Space has many applications, tactically speaking, primarily but not entirely tactical communications. The more the Space Force speaks of strategy and independence, the more you can be sure the Navy will hold on to every single space asset and capability they have. The Army should as well, but if history is any indication, they won't. The demand of independence, which implies an inherent disregard of supporting other branches, as demonstrated by the Air Force for the past 80 years, ensures that the well-meaning establishment of the Space Force will probably not lead to the desired synchronization or efficacy which drove its establishment. Like air support, everyone will carve out as much as they can under their own control, lest their required support be abandoned for projects interesting to the Space Force, but useless to the other services. 5 little Space Forces all operating independently from each other. The only change being we went from 4 to 5. Unity of command indeed. I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer with the new Space Force, but it is just a little brother to the Air Force. Same secretariat, same academy, effectively the same uniforms. The irony is its creation was demanded because the Air Force's failure to take space as seriously as it does manned aircraft. History may yet prove my pessimism misplaced, but we shall see. But this closes out our final domain and the services that fight there. But what of those nations that aren't quite so well endowed with space capabilities? Well, they will find a way, which leads us to next week's subject, terrorism. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit, and check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and hope you join us again next week. See you then.